Well, good morning if you are in Santa Barbara, California, or perhaps Santa Fe, New Mexico. Good afternoon if you're in St. Louis, Missouri, New York City. Good evening if you are in Serbia or Slovenia or Trieste. Greetings to people all around the world, wherever you're watching Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Idagio, the place where classical music happens. As you know, Idagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to music lovers all around the world. My guest today is a very talented person. I only have talented people on my show, but she's, even by the measure of talented, she's very talented. And she's very nice and she's very intelligent. And she's someone I've wanted to have on for a long time. But Daniela Candillari is a very busy person. So I'm very happy, Daniela, that you are here. You're joining us in New York City, but this is just one of the many places where you keep your baton and your dog. So,
Absolutely.
Daniela, welcome.
Thank you,
I'm going to
Fred.
start by telling people you are a conductor. We'll get into where you
Mhm.
conduct. You are a teacher. You are a composer. Um, you grew up, to my knowledge, in Serbia and Slovenia, both.
Mhm.
Talk
That
about
is
growing up in
correct.
one or the other or both.
Absolutely. When I was born, it was still the same country. It was Yugoslavia.
Mhm.
And by the time I was a young person, a young child, that country started fracturing. So Slovenia was the first one to separate from Yugoslavia, and then we had the war that lasted about 4 years in the 90s. And I was a young teenager when my mom and my stepdad moved from Serbia and went to Slovenia, and I went with them. So growing up in both places was growing up in Yugoslavia. Of course, I have incredible nostalgic memories, and I think it was sort of the perfect place to grow up. It was a country where everybody had everything. Sort of sports and arts were supported by the community, by the government. If you showed any talent and if you wanted to exceed in that talent, the sky was the limit. So, in terms of sort of society and culture that we grew up in, I think it was the perfect place to grow up in. Of course, what wasn't perfect and what was less than ideal is the war that followed. And it caused a lot of people to lose their homes. A lot of marriages fell apart between Croatians and Serbians, or Bosnians and Serbians, Bosnians and Croatians. And the whole country that was really, really well rounded geographically, economically, culturally, just completely fractured. And in the middle of that war was when we moved to Slovenia. And so it was a little bit of like a new kid on the block, starting from a country that until 5 minutes ago was the same place, and suddenly it wasn't anymore. And I stayed in Slovenia. I'm still a Slovenian citizen, and I still have a home in both Serbia and Slovenia. But I stayed in Slovenia actively as a teenager for about 4 years until I then went to Austria to study when I was 15. So my memories of Slovenia are very transitional from that period. I just remember, going to school and music school and playing piano and practicing a lot and sort of trying to find myself in that new environment, learning a new language, and so on, and sort of, finding a way to have roots in a completely new place. And growing up in Serbia, on the other hand, was sort of exactly the opposite. I was a child of the city. Both of my parents were athletes. My grandmother was an opera singer, so it was a very different experience between both of those.
Did you grow up in Belgrade?
No, I grew up in Novi Sad, which is
I know
about an
Novi
hour
Sad.
north of Belgrade. Have you been there?
Oh, yes.
Oh, okay, do tell.
And after you and I will get together for dinner, there's a restaurant I go to in New York all the time. The waiter is from Novi Sad.
Which restaurant is it?
I'll tell you after.
Okay.
I'll
Okay.
take you there. But the waiter is from
Sounds
Novi
good.
Sad.
Sounds good. There are a
Um,
couple of places in New York, I'm sorry, but there are a couple of places in New York that I found they're Serbian waiters or Serbian co-owners. So I I think I've been to five of them or so, and
Yep.
it always feels like going home a little bit.
Yep. Well, I'm going to get into Serbia and Chicago and Cleveland maybe later, but I don't know if what you know about me in terms of my background. People know me for Italy, but
Hmm.
one part of my Italian knowledge that's very specific is the Northeast, the region of Friuli, Venezia Giulia, and the
Hmm.
capital
Hmm.
Trieste, the other major city, Udine. And
Hmm.
I wrote a big book about that region called La Terra Fortunata.
Hmm.
And to do that, it meant spending a great deal of time in the lands that are on the border of Friuli, Venezia Giulia, which is to say Slovenia, where I've been countless times, Serbia, Croatia, Montenegro, um, Istria, which is an area that's a bit contested,
Yeah.
obviously Austria, Hungary, and so on, because part of what the book is, it's a cultural history, but it's also the food of Friuli, Venezia Giulia.
Hmm.
And to talk about the food of Friuli, Venezia Giulia, which, as I say, is the point in Europe where Slavic, Latin, and uh, let's call it Germanic converge. And there's
Hmm.
not one or the other that predominates. It's all of them together. And the language is very local. The foods are very particular. The influences, for example, famous Prague ham that we think of for Prague, most of it is made in Trieste. Most of the violins and the wood for the violins that was created for Vienna and Budapest came from around Trieste.
Hmm.
So this exchange that happened and happens in that area, um, Trieste was under Austria, the Habsburgs, from 1361 to
Hmm.
1918. And the
Correct.
rail lines that were built from Trieste to Vienna and Ljubljana and Belgrade and Budapest and Prague and Salzburg and so on, it's all right there. And you can feel the
Hmm.
connections. And you go through the mountains and you discover languages that people spoke hundreds of years ago. And the title of the book, La Terra Fortunata, came from a winemaker from a place very close to the Slovenian border, in which the ground is not very fertile. It's very muddy. It's not congenial for growing wine, and yet that's where his family was for many
Hmm.
centuries. And it's very muddy. And I was with him one day, and his hands were caked in mud. And he said, "Questa è la mia terra fortunata. This is my fortunate land, but soil."
Yeah.
Because he said, no matter who the government or the religion of the occupier was, our land was still who we were. And I met many, many people who were, quote, Austrian or Viennese because they
Hmm.
were born at a time when they could be transported to, or their mothers transported to Vienna to give birth in Vienna. I was in Gorica, Gorizia,
Hmm.
and met
Gorizia.
a
Hmm.
very old man who was a Habsburg descendant.
Wow.
And what is and true story, um, he was gay and he had a manservant and he lived alone in a sort of a castle. And I only mentioned he was gay. He had no descendants, and therefore the line would end with him. And but he didn't know much about soccer, about football. And the young man who took care of him was watching a football game on TV, a soccer game. And the old man said to him, "Who's playing?" And the young man said, "Austria, Hungary." And the old man said, "Oh, really? Against who?" And he was not
Oh,
joking.
yeah.
And I mention this because despite all the changes, the political changes, the cultural changes, the Euro wars, and so on, the fact that the First World War began in effect in Sarajevo,
Hmm.
um, the past is very present. If you go to Ljubljana, the railway station, the market, a lot of the town that's in Slovenia feels like the
Hmm.
way it must have been once upon a time.
Exactly. I mean, there's a lot of, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there are, my hometown, Novi Sad, is the same. It feels like it's somehow captured a little bit in the past. Novi Sad also used to belong to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And it was Belgrade was sort of a division between the Ottoman Empire and Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so as a child, I got to experience a lot of that culture. And so, fast forward a couple of years later, when I went to study, I studied in Austria, in Graz and in Vienna. And it was in a way seeing my hometown on a different level, on a different scale.
I knew in the town of Cormones. I don't know if you've been to Cormones. It's right on the border of Slovenia in Italy, but the end of the road is Slovenia, and you
Hmm.
just pass. There's no border anymore. You just pass into Slovenia, and so Cormones was on a road that went to Vienna, and Cormones had very famous wine, but also excellent plums. And women who were about to give birth in their seventh month were transported to Vienna with plums and prunes and apricots and dried fruits.
Hmm.
And the food was sold to the Naschmarkt in Vienna.
Hmm.
And this helped pay for her time in Vienna. She received medical care in Vienna. It was very modern for, we're talking hundreds of years ago. Um, and then after the baby was born and was made an Austrian citizen, it would be brought back to Cormones. And this is everywhere throughout. And the sense of exchange, the sense of, yes, the empire is gone and probably a good thing, but um, the degree to which it's still felt is remarkable. I don't feel it with the British Empire. I don't
Hmm.
feel it with the Russian Empire to the same degree. Yes, you can go to India and they speak English as the common language.
Hmm.
There are roads and railways and so on.
Hmm.
And maybe the schooling, if you go to East Africa, some of the restrictive laws of the British remain more in Uganda than they do in London. Certainly, the United States had a parting of ways with the United Kingdom, but somehow what was known as Austria Felix, Happy Austria, which is a euphemism, but nonetheless, there was a sense of bureaucracy that gave a certain standard of living to the people. Empress Maria Theresa in the 18th century would identify a town and say, that town has a gift for chair making, so we will put a factory there to make chairs for the empire.
Hmm.
Or here violin and there ham and there cheese and there something else, and medicine here and music there. And it was remarkably organized. And apart from anti-Semitism and disease and a lot of other horrible things, it worked. And there is that connection. And you fly Austrian Airlines, and somehow on Austrian Airlines you fly to Vienna, and you connect to everywhere in the former Habsburg Empire.
Absolutely. And that direct flight actually from New York to Vienna it was one of my favorite flights to take. There's a very different experience with Austrian Airlines. And the way that they play Mozart immediately when you step into the plane. I mean, it's a world in its own way.
Well, not to promote Austrian Airlines, but I've always liked that on their airline, there are opera videos that you could watch on the
Exactly.
TV
Yeah,
screen. On
exactly.
most
Yeah.
US airlines, their idea of classical music, well, I won't go there, but a famous Italian who sings, and they call him an opera singer, but he's not. But, he's famous, and people say, oh, I love that. Or maybe the Phantom of the Opera, but they don't
Mm,
have, you know, Bruckner.
right.
Austrian Airlines will go
Right.
all the way and have Bruckner and,
Exactly. Yeah.
Schoenberg, and not just, I love Mozart, obviously, but not just Eine kleine Nachtmusik, but
Exactly.
they'll
There's
have a whole Bruckner
the
symphony.
the repertoire is a bit bigger.
Yeah. So, um, you then went to Austria to study, which
Mhm.
makes sense. What brought you to the US?
Initially, it was a Fulbright scholarship
Huh.
at Indiana University. That was my initial sort of introduction to United States. But as a child, I have to say, I always had specific curiosity about United States. I can't say why specifically. I can't really pinpoint a moment in my life when that happened. A little bit of our history family with my grandmother, who was an opera singer. She actually came to New York in 1957 to perform at NBC TV station.
Hmm.
And I talked to her about it because she was my entry into the opera world, and I was just in love with the opera world from when I was 5 years old. And I asked her sort of, about that experience, and she said, "Oh, I don't know, honey. I was there for 3 days, and I went to perform, and the manager drove me everywhere, and then I just went back home." And that was sort of the closest anybody from our family got to being in United States or performing here. And so I had this incredible urge and drive to not just come to United States, but to travel the world. I was really curious about languages, about different cultures. I wanted to see as much as possible. And so then my first introduction to United States came through a Fulbright Scholarship to Indiana University. And
Daniela,
I
what I'd
studied.
like you to do is talk
Mhm.
more about the Fulbright Scholarship, what it means. I was a Fulbright scholar,
Okay.
and to Italy, to La Scala.
Oh, yeah.
And so therefore, I very deeply feel what that means. But Fulbright was a senator from the United States, and they created the idea not only to send Americans abroad, to
Hmm.
bring people elsewhere to the
Yeah.
US. And that was part of the great idea. So I know the experience of going to Milan. I had
Hmm.
lived in Italy for many years before, so this was just more. But how did you apply for it? How did you hear of it? Um, what did you as a musician have to do?
Hmm.
And then talk about the impact of getting a Fulbright scholarship.
The application was actually an interesting point. Since I was studying in, like we said, in Graz, there was a summer festival, American Institute of Musical Studies, that was
Hmm.
taking place in Graz during the summer. And one year I saw they were giving out scholarships for pianists. I was a pianist, and every student always needs a scholarship. So I just thought, well, I'll just apply and sort of see, what happens. And what ended up happening is that they accepted me as a student for the summer festival. And that was my first time working with entirely American faculty and a huge contingency of American singers and American instrumentalists. And I was talking to one of the professors at the festival, and he asked me, "Had you ever been to the United States?" And I said, "No, I would love to go." And he said, "You might want to apply for Fulbright." And that's when I started looking into the application process. Now, at that time, I was already doing my PhD in Vienna. So I had finished my master's in piano performance and I started my PhD in Vienna. And I thought, well, this program sounds perfect when I finish my PhD or as I'm writing my thesis or however it works out. And fortunately, one of my PhD topic was Joseph Marx, Austrian composer
Hmm.
from 1884, 1964, I think, if I remember the dates completely correctly right now. And Joseph Marx had a number of students that immigrated to United States, and they were big advocates of his music in United States. And for those that may not be familiar with his music, his biggest over are the songs. I think there are 200 songs, which is one of the largest numbers of songs written. But his orchestral work is as fascinating as music by Richard Strauss. So he was really fighting the second Viennese school, and he was really fighting the atonality, and he wanted sort of to keep this tradition of modern of post romantic musical language alive. And because of that, I think a lot of his students were advocates for his music in United States. So when I applied for Fulbright, the question was, why do you want to go to United States? And I actually really wanted to experience what was the musical landscape in United States that was really happening at universities, that was happening in real life, not just things that were on media, that were on TV. But I really wanted to get into the mindset of American people and of all of these composers who had moved to United States, not just composers, but also performers and musicians. And I was always also fascinated with the entire group that moved to United States, with Korngold, with Krenek, obviously Stravinsky, Schoenberg as well. So there was clearly some parallel in my mind of things that I wanted to find out. So that was my application process. I filled out the application. I stated all of these facts and said, this is what I would like to, why I would like to apply for Fulbright, and, hopefully I'll get it. And then the next round was the interview. And we had to put in three schools where we would consider going. Number one for me was Indiana University. And that came through recommendation to some of the friends I made at the Ames Festival who had studied at Indiana, and they sort of thought that that would be the perfect place for me. The next one was Michigan University, and then Manhattan School of Music. Those were my three choices.
Hmm. All great.
And all great, and all
Great.
had, with the exception of Indiana University, that didn't necessarily have a specific piano accompaniment program, or what is the word? Piano accompaniment is the best one I can come
Hmm.
up. Collaborative piano. There we go.
Yep.
Both Michigan and Manhattan had piano collaborative program, and that was my interest at the time. I wanted to be a chamber musician, and I wanted to learn as much as possible about working with different musicians. And I applied. I got invited to the interview, which was already a surprise. And then the interview happened, and that was it. And so a couple of months later, I heard that I was actually awarded a Fulbright scholarship. So my first choice happened. It was Indiana University. And I spent on a Fulbright 8 months at Indiana University. I started in January, and went until August. And for me, it was sort of the perfect place to be. Like I said, there wasn't a collaborative piano program, but I studied with Emil Naumov, who was last of Nadia Boulanger's students. And I could sort of, in some ways, I could make my time at Indiana what I wanted it to be, which
Hmm.
was a ton of chamber music, a ton of opera coaching, and just a ton of experiencing different things, and learning as much as possible. Um, it was fantastic. I mean, I studied in Austria, and I have very strong Austrian systems in my mind, but I always think that Indiana University is my alma mater, because that's where all of the things that I studied in Austria somehow came into focus because of the flexibility I had with Fulbright program in terms of making my own studies happen.
Um, it is in the best way a shocking thing to learn you've got a Fulbright. Um,
Yes.
because it really is life changing. They're very
Yes.
competitive. They're hard to get. And,
Yes.
I don't brag about it because
Hmm.
I'm not a braggart, despite what some people think, but I'm really not. But I feel very honored and fortunate to have gotten it. And it changed so much for me because I
Hmm.
had already worked in many Italian theaters.
Hmm.
And the way I got in, so to speak, was at that time there were 21 slots for Americans to go to Italy. It was very competitive.
Hmm.
And there were, I think, 400 applicants, something like that, or finalists. And 20 of them were every year. One of them was every other year. And you were to go to the University of Pavia, which is a college south of Milan,
Hmm.
that's built on the British college system, more like Oxford or Cambridge than like an
Hmm.
Italian university. And you're part of a college, not part of the university. And I was at what's called the Collegio Ghislieri, which was founded in 1565. And Goldoni studied there, and Alessandro Volta, and all kinds of people. And it's an old building from the time, and it's a half hour south of Milan. And I propose to do contemporary history. Now, contemporary history in Italy means the past 200 years, and modern history is the past 400 years. But focus specifically on Giuseppe Verdi,
Hmm.
because I had worked at other theaters, this is a long story short, and had the invitation to work at La Scala as a student, um,
Hmm.
if I could get the funding. And so the Fulbright was to live in Pavia, south of Milan, but in
Hmm.
effect be a commuter every day to Milan. And I found a place to sleep in Milan, and I was there most of the time. But on Mondays, I taught in Pavia.
Oh, wow.
and
Yeah.
it was a wonderful setup. And it's another world because you are suddenly becoming a colleague to
Hmm.
these incredibly wonderful musicians and artists and administrators too.
Yeah.
Um, and I learned from them. And one of them, very specifically, I was the assistant to the stage director, Giorgio Strehler. And
Hmm.
Giorgio was from Trieste. So I spent a lot of time in Trieste and your part of the world with Giorgio. And that was the part of the connection to that. But when you have a Fulbright, other things too, but certainly Fulbright, it's kind of like that opens the door for you. And people are accepting of you if you say I'm a Fulbright, and then you can do what you want and you don't abuse it. But on the other hand, you have this opportunity to sit at the hand, at the elbow, at the knee, on the floor, or wherever in the fly space for me,
Hmm.
um, learning and watching these masters. And if you would ask me what I took away, it was cumulative. I stayed 2 years.
Hmm.
It was cumulative of all of these experiences and
Yeah.
these learning, plus
Yeah.
meeting people who I would later work with at the Met
Hmm.
for a long time,
Hmm.
other theaters. Um, it was really life changing. And Renee Fleming had one to Frankfurt,
Hmm.
and her German wonderful before, but she really immersed that way there.
Hmm.
And when I talk to people who are fortunate to have Fulbrights, it really is life changing. And I underscore this. I think the website is fulbright.org. People watching who are interested in trying to make a go of their careers, if they're lucky to get one, because they're really not easy to get, try for it because it's very special.
100%.
Yeah.
The year that I got Fulbright from Slovenia, I think there were three of us who came to United States, and I think one person went for economy, one went for business or law, and then I was the one for music, and it was just an incredible like email to open back in the back in those days and to see, oh, you've been awarded a Fulbright scholarship. I mean, I'm to this day grateful for that experience and grateful for being introduced. What was really a learning moment for me, because after Fulbright, I ended up staying at Indiana University for 2 years and I got my second master's in jazz piano. But at the same time, I was working as opera coach at Indiana University in a teaching fellowship. And just seeing different systems of how theaters work. And of course, Indiana University is a university, and it functions a little bit different than a professional opera company, but just understanding the system, the scheduling, sort of
Hmm.
we would have weekly meetings with music staff and check in who is doing how, and what do we need to focus on, and how is the production going, anything that needs to be addressed. I mean, that structure alone was incredibly important when I then left Indiana University and went back to Slovenia and started working there at the National Opera, because it just sort of put in this system in my mind of this is how things can be executed, and this is really the sort of logical way of doing things. It was incredible. It was life changing.
My training is in the US, Italy, and to some degree the UK and France. I
Hmm.
did not do any formal studies in the German speaking world for music, for opera production, things like that. For language, yes. Um, so I can make comparisons between the strengths and weaknesses of Italy, America, and to some degree France and the UK. I would love for you to talk about the differences in what you learned and the strengths of the Austrian German system and the American system.
Oof, that's a really good question. I mean, I was a student in Austria, so again, my experience of Austria comes from that background. But I think there is a little bit more. I think basically how we fund arts in different continents influences how we think about production of arts.
Mhm.
And I think in United States we have to be really careful about every minute, every day. for instance, when I go into rehearsals with an orchestra, um, I get asked, what is the schedule you would like to do? And I've conducted in Europe now. I've never been asked, what would you like to do? The schedule is the schedule. So you sort of figure out, at least that was my experience so far. You figure out what needs to be done once you're there. Once you see what has strengths and where the weaknesses are, then you sort of adjust the schedule according to that. So I think this pre-planning is stronger in United States. I also think in Europe, again, this was my experience, there was sometimes a little bit more room left for a production or for a rehearsal. This happened in Slovenia. We were working on a new production with a stage director who was new to opera, and I was a chorus master at that time, and we sort of, with production, with our company, with our house, we said, well, given the entire schedule of everything that the chorus has to do in this time, this is how many rehearsals we can have so that
Hmm.
people don't get sick, that they can really perform at their best, that we have enough time to prepare the music. And we sort of came up with a number of rehearsals that this director could have. And they just said, well, I need three times more. And we said,
Hmm.
well, that's not going to happen. I
Yep.
mean, unless you want everybody to get sick in week three and nobody to
Right.
show up to work, that's not going to happen. So I think there's a little bit more flexibility in terms of how many rehearsals we can have, versus prescribing how many rehearsals are
Hmm.
possible.
Yeah.
But I think that's a very, very basic answer, very sort of practical answer that I've experienced so far.
This next question is for you as a musician, as a conductor primarily. Um, one of the great working experiences of my life was working on the Otto Schenk Gunther Schneider Simpson ring cycle at the Met in the 1980s, helping it developed, structured, rehearsed. Um, it was an amazing experience. We had a great cast. James Levine was in full glory. The orchestra was magnificent. The chorus in Götterdämmerung was great. Um, and I remember that the first opera we did was not Rheingold, but it was Walküre.
Mm,
Before doing the complete cycle, the first production was Walküre, and I was at a rehearsal of Act One, and it was Jesse Norman and Gary Lakes, if I recall,
okay.
Zygmunt and Sieglinde. And Levine was conducting magnificently. The two of them were singing out, and it was fabulous. Now, I believe in unions. I believe in protection of workers. I believe in work breaks and so on. They were at a musical nirvana in this rehearsal. I'm getting goosebumps that for all my life in opera, there were a few moments like that moment. And Abe, what was his last name? Marcus, maybe the orchestra manager, Abe something, um, was sitting there with his watch and and Norman and Lakes were just singing and Levine in the orchestra and everything was fantastic and suddenly time and
Yep.
everyone had to stop. And it was kind of like we all exhaled and we're all deflated and suddenly like cut
Yeah.
down.
Yeah.
And I said to Levine after, how can you do that? He said, I've learned to do that. And I said, but it was glorious. He said, I know we were doing something particularly good this moment. And I would like to have continued. You can't.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that?
I mean, I heard that Ingmar Bergman would do the same thing. It did not matter if people called lunch at noon, it was lunch, no matter if you were on a high note, on a low note, or
Oh,
wherever. And I think there is a moment of sort of deflation, as you said, when that happens. But I think reverse psychology, I think there's also a good moment in reflecting back and looking at how did we achieve this and can we do this the next time. So it's hard. It's hard being in the moment when, when you're 5 minutes away from finishing a dress rehearsal and you
yeah.
get call time. And then it's just sort of one of those things, well, that's,
In this
that's
case, it
it, I
was about
guess. Yeah.
90 seconds from the end of the act.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
as they, not Jesse Norman, I was going to say, as they run up and not Gary Lakes, as they move up the stage to have this exultation and the orchestra goes wild
Yeah.
and, the crowd, if they were there, would go wild. But I just figured, can't you add 90 seconds at the end of the break and, just let them finish that? But
Right. Well,
such
yeah.
were and maybe are the rules, at least in the Met and in New York and in the States, that if it's a 12 o'clock hard stop or 1:30, whatever, that's it.
It's a 12 o'clock. Exactly. I mean, I think elongating anything then starts a chain reaction of life as well.
Yeah.
And but just from sort of the musical standpoint, I like to think of these moments, well, this is one of the moments where we don't have control. And time has control over us and we sort of submit to that. And then you sort of start thinking, well, okay, what made that great moment? What made it and how can we achieve it next time? I remember reading a while ago about Sviatoslav Richta whenever he would play a recital, immediately after the recital, this is just a point about reflection and sort of uh, self self-identifying problems or fixing them. Whenever he would play a recital, he would go back immediately after the recital and remember the places that didn't work out as he had hoped to, and he would practice them that evening while things were still fresh. So the optimistic, idealistic part of me wants to say when time calls to stop, that's our moment to sort of go back and do that work and reflect on rehearsal and then move on to the next one. I don't
So
have a better
now I'm going to
explanation.
bring the same conundrum to you from the point of view of a man who manages theaters, that sometimes we would have tragedies, emergencies, whatever, where I or someone would have to stop the performance.
Hmm.
And I remember the sense of deflation that would come with that. And
Hmm.
often I and the stage manager would be the people who had to deal with whatever the problem was.
Yeah.
And I remember that I always tried to factor in not just the feelings of the person to whom the event happened, but to
Hmm.
the performers and what they were enduring, but to the audience that was on this wonderful ride and in a magical place with music, whatever. And then suddenly I had to bring them back to reality safely.
Yeah.
And it's not easy. I don't name names here, but we had a very famous situation at the Met in which an artist was injured by a piece of scenery, and we had to stop the performance, and she did not want to. She wanted to continue, and she insisted on continuing, and she did.
Hmm.
There was a discussion backstage that I frankly lost, that I felt that given her effort, she should have gotten a curtain call if she wanted one. The stage
Hmm.
manager said no curtain call. I said I will bring her out and just hold her. She was injured, but she was not dead, but she was
Yeah.
injured. Um, that I would hold her up and just have her get her curtain call, because we then had to take her to the hospital to be examined. The house doctor looked at her briefly and said, well, she's okay
Hmm.
for a curtain call. But I was overruled by the, not that I would be overruled, but the stage manager said, I really don't want to do that. And so I accepted his wishes on that. But I felt very bad for the artist because I then took her to the hospital
Yeah.
and she didn't have the audience's support coming
Yeah.
away. All she had was the focus on her injury.
Mm.
And she recovered eventually. It took a while,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it's always a judgment. I'll tell another very famous story that everyone knows about. Um, there was a man who committed suicide at the Metropolitan Opera during a broadcast. And did you know this?
Whoa.
You weren't
No.
listening that week. It was during a live broadcast.
Whoa.
And I was the manager, and I had to stop the performance. Thankfully, he didn't kill anyone else in the process, but it was a live international broadcast. And what happened was that Peter Allen, who was the host, said an audience member has been taken ill, which was true in a way. Um, but in saying that, the Met switchboard, the telephone was bombarded with calls. Is my mother okay? Is my son okay? My daughter's in the
Hmm.
cast. My son is attending, whatever. and it created a problem.
Yeah.
And everyone was okay except for the man who committed suicide.
Yeah.
It was all over the papers, and people can look it up and so on. I'm the one who knew who he was and identified the body. I'm the one who canceled the performance. Um, but my goal was to, number one, humanely treat him, uh,
Hmm.
take care of the audience, but also as a Saturday matinee, I wanted to get the evening show on. But you cannot remove a body if it's declared dead. So everyone kind of, who was on the scene said, is he okay? Well, we're going to take him to the hospital. We'll see. Because if he were declared dead, we couldn't move him. Then it's a
Oh
crime
my
scene.
God. Yeah.
And I'm mentioning this because when we're in a theater and when we're working and when we're trying to get a show on and there are 4,000 people at the Met, and many people in the cast and so on, there are all these variables. And sometimes, like it or not, life intercedes and we have to deal
Hmm.
with this. Sometimes the scenery breaks. I remember one time we were doing
Hmm.
Parsifal, and again, Peter Allen was the host. It was a radio broadcast, and Peter Allen, who was a genius, spoke for 17 minutes about Parsifal and did a riff on Parsifal until the scenery was fixed. In the case of the opera that the suicide happened in, which was Verdi's Macbetto, um,
Mm.
we couldn't do that. So I said, let's put on an older performance with Renata Scotto and Cheryl Milne. So we did
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
for the radio in Act Three. I had to deal with the tenor playing Macduff, who was angry. He said that I canceled the show so he couldn't sing his big aria in Act Three. But this is life in a theater, and this is
Yeah.
it's wonderful and frustrating, and you're on a high
Yeah.
wire all at the same time. And
Hmm.
what I'd like you to address now, please, because it's not about me, but it's about our experiences, is as a conductor, when you're in the pit, when you are guiding what's happening in the orchestra pit and on the stage for an opera. And speak, please, to that fact that you're not only conducting the music in the
Hmm.
orchestra, you are in effect
But
directing
also, yeah.
on the stage, but
Yeah.
you have an audience behind you. You have a
Hmm.
theater building in front of you and above you, and you have technology. You have everything going on. And I've
Hmm.
never asked a conductor this before. How do you mentally prioritize, and how do you bring a performance forward? Obviously, you know the music.
Obviously, you know the music. I think for me, it's before we go into a performance, it's musically seeing the beginning to the end. So, just sort of from my own personal performance rituals, I always seclude myself 30 minutes before the performance and I just sort of meditate about the music and transitions and sort of where are we going. That's always the main question. But absolutely to your point of conducting the pit and the stage, I mean the marriage of those two is what makes opera so exciting. It's really seeing the expansion of the orchestra in some ways by putting one element of it on stage. That makes it incredibly fun and incredibly exhilarating. And it adds another level of chamber music that
Mhm.
is there. Um, Priorities for me are always, well, safety of everybody and music of the piece that we're doing. Now we did have a really fun experience, and this was maybe the most memorable experience that I had conducting Tosca. It was a matinee performance, and I think a couple of audience members went for a brunch before and had a great time at brunch, and then came to see Tosca. And this was the liveliest audience I had ever seen in an opera performance. When Tosca stabbed Scarpia, somebody yelled, "You go, girl," and things like that. And right before she jumped, somebody else yelled, "No, don't do that." And it was just incredible. But when these moments between audience and performance, when that sort of collective performing can happen, I think that's just incredibly memorable and fun, and it just gives performance a very different angle, and it gives a little bit more meaning to the real life. Um, but I don't know if that answers the question, and I feel like I went off
It
on a
does.
tangent
It
right
certainly
now.
does. But I think what I want to add to that is your consciousness of all the elements, or do you just assume that everyone is taking care of their job? Or do you feel you have to in some way guide people or at least monitor that the jobs are being well done? Obviously, you
Um,
don't have to deal with the front of house, the management, the
right,
technology, but you may be aware that a light is out on the stage or that the
absolutely,
diva is not, she's about to
exactly.
fall if she doesn't pick up her dress, that kind of thing.
Exactly. I mean, I'm aware of that stuff. Speaking of front of the house, recently at a there was a performance where the audience was really, really close to the pit, and the curtain between the rod of the pit and the audience was not super long. So one of the audience members kept on sort of pushing their feet under that curtain, and it almost hit the first violinist in the head. So, so I mean, you notice those things because you look out that people can actually do their jobs and can do what we're all there to do. So there is awareness of all of those things. If a light goes out in the pit, that has happened. It's somehow my job to alert the stage management that we need
Yeah,
help. If it happens in rehearsal, it's better because we can actually stop a rehearsal. If it happens in a performance, it might be a little bit
going.
trickier.
Yeah.
But those are all things that also make theater memorable and sort of I think there's always an element for the audience where they say, "Well, I was there when that happened." You know, it's just like um,
True.
participation.
And
Yeah.
here's another question I've never asked a conductor that you've
Hmm.
elicited. Um, when you come in and turn and take your bow to the audience, in most theaters that I've ever worked in, right behind the conductor's podium are people who are seated.
Hmm.
Do you see them? Do you hear them? Are you aware of them? Do you not look at them? Do you look over their heads off into row K?
Because of the lights, because of the conductor light going on the podium, it's really hard to see anything
Mm-hmm.
actually. So I do look out into the audience, but I see figures, I see silhouettes. So I never know who is sitting behind me. I can hear them if there's anything, I can sometimes hear them.
Yeah.
But that's pretty much that I have been able to experience. I did witness once a conductor. I was watching a performance and the conductor came in to take their bow, and I was sitting close enough that I could hear them, and they greeted the first row of the audience members, sort of,
Mm-hmm.
"Good evening, how are you?" And I thought that was a nice gesture. Um, but I think it's really, really hard to actually see the faces and to know who is sitting right behind you. Which I think it's a blessing in disguise. I think it's better sometimes that we don't know who is right
Yeah.
behind us.
I mean, I've known many audience members who sit behind the conductor because they want to watch her or him
Hmm. Hmm.
work. Um,
Yeah.
I've also had people not know what that phenomenon is about and come out and complain to me, the manager, and say, I couldn't see over his arms, or he's singing along and I can't hear Leontine Price. I only hear James Levine. And but I've known other audience members, many in fact, who will buy a ticket in the first box, house left or house right, to
Hmm.
watch the conductor.
Yeah.
I have friends in the UK who have a box at Covent Garden in house right, stage left. So when I sit with them, we see Antonio Papano, we see whoever is
Hmm.
conducting, and that's kind of
Yeah.
wonderful, but we don't see what's on the stage.
Yeah.
A little we see, but we really see the orchestra work, and I love that, but it's a different
Right.
opera experience. So if it's my 500th La Boheme or Fidelio, I'll watch the pit, and that's fine. But if it's an opera I really don't know and want
Right.
to see, I wouldn't prefer to sit there.
You wouldn't sit there. Hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, I find watching the orchestra and watching the pit is really, really interesting because you see things, you learn so much by observing other people and what they do. Um, but then you also miss sometimes a little bit of the stage. So
Mhm.
if I catch myself actually watching more into the orchestra, I will go and see the same production and just sit somewhere different where I can have that experience of actually seeing the entire performance and not
Mhm.
necessarily focusing on one element.
I want to get into some of your conducting in the places you conduct a lot, but for the moment, let's hypothetically take a theater that you've never conducted in before.
Okay.
So, when you recently conducted Grounded, was that your first time at the Kennedy Center?
That was
Okay,
my first time.
that's a good
Yes.
example. You were conducting the world premiere of an opera,
Hmm.
Grounded. That's a co-production with the Metropolitan Opera, but it premiered in Washington at the Kennedy Center by Janine Tesori and George Brandt, and is coming to the Met, I believe, in
Hmm.
September of
Yes.
2024. And not only were you doing a new work, and therefore you in your head as a conductor created a sound world, your preferences, your the things you wanted to emphasize, but you were doing it in a space that you had never worked in before, and therefore not familiar with how it
Hmm.
would sound in the pit and on the stage.
Yeah.
Typically, you would get rehearsals initially in a rehearsal room and not in
Hmm.
the pit. And therefore, the way you seated your musicians to create the sound that you wanted to hear as a conductor might have been different in the rehearsal room with a different acoustic than it ultimately would be in the orchestra pit. Talk for the opera Grounded,
Hmm.
how you created this transition, number one, of learning the music, creating your
Hmm.
ideas, talking with the
Hmm.
composer in this case, then doing
Hmm.
it in rehearsal in the rehearsal room, and then bringing it to the pit in rehearsal and then with an audience.
Right. Well, studying music, and I want to say particularly studying contemporary music, somehow happens easily for me. I can quickly make connections. I can quickly see patterns, and I can sort of see the structure really, really fast and really easily. So something happens in my brain with contemporary music that just information fires quickly. And I don't know whether that stems from my subconscious um not allegiances to contemporary music, but just from my subconscious like different tastes in music that I have, and a little bit of eclectic at the same time. Um, but studying always happens at the piano. It always starts with the piano vocal score, playing through it, singing the parts, learning the parts, and learning that, and then adding the orchestral layer to that, and understanding sort of who plays what and how it's voiced, and thinking about the voicing of the chords, and if it's chords, or sort of thinking about textures that every opera brings. With Grounded specifically, there were two workshops before we did it at Washington National Opera, and I was part of the first workshop. So I had a little bit of an advantage in that I knew most of the material already by the time we started production. And then in rehearsal room, it was great working with Janine sort of side by side, because it's so invaluable having a composer really sit next to me and tell me exactly what they meant. And, you know, sometimes my instincts, I think everybody's instincts are right, and we can sort of read into composer's mind, but sometimes notation can prevent that. Notation can actually guide us in possibly a different way. So it was really great to be talking to Janine and really understand what she was hearing and what she wanted to hear. Then the next level was of after music rehearsals, which we had for um, full day, one day. Then we started staging rehearsals, and then we would intersperse music rehearsal with staging rehearsals throughout next 2 weeks or so. Then we moved on to the stage, which was the first time that I was in the pit actually, and seeing the distance and the vastness of that pit and the distance between the stage, which that is always the first adjustment that needs to happen. For me personally, at least, sort of
Mhm.
understanding how far everybody really is. Um, and then we went into the orchestra readings, which were in a rehearsal room, and then translated those into the pit. Now, with orchestra rehearsals, I always get in touch with orchestra managers and librarians, and I will talk to them if the orchestra already has a preference of seating that they like to do. Most orchestras sit in the way that works for them. And so I will work with that unless
Hmm.
there's really something that is just that is going against every bone in my body. For instance, like I don't know, I don't want to have wind separate from brass, for instance. Um, but that's always a conversation, and usually what ends up happening is a walk through of the pit and seeing this plan that we made if it really really works. Now, there are certain geographical differences, again, between European orchestras and American orchestras in how orchestras sit and what the pit sitting is like. And then I think there are also personal preferences. For instance, I love to have my first and second violins together. There are some orchestras and some conductors who like to have them separate and then
Yeah.
sort of fill out violas, celli, and basses in one angle. I prefer a little bit of different things in that way. But again, I work with the companies. I work with the players. They are, at the end of the day, they're the ones who have to sit in the pit. Um, Fortunately, Kennedy Center has a wonderful pit that can fit everyone,
Hmm.
but sometimes it's just about figuring out who is going to suffer the least in a certain amount of space.
Yeah.
I remember one of my early projects in New York. Excuse me. The pit was so small, and we had to fit an entire drum set in it. And the orchestra wasn't massive, but just because drum sets took up such a massive part of the pit, we had to figure out everybody else around it and outside and inside. And I remember the poor second violinist, she sort of offered to sit in this place where she could use about this much of her bow. But she was such a champion. She just said, "Oh, that's okay. Like this is a sacrifice that I'm making, and it's fine."
Was the
But at the
viola
end of the
even
day,
allowed in the building?
um, but
Poor viola players, who I love them,
I know, I know. But at the end of the day, I always think conductors, we always have our space.
yeah.
The sort of biggest adjustment we need to make is if we're on a riser, how high that riser is, if it's low, if we can see the stage. And that's really the thing that we have to worry about. But players have to be able to move their bows, to pick up their instruments, to breathe properly, to have if they have double instruments, they have to have room for that. So I always listen to the players because they know what they need. I can sort of say this is my preference,
Hmm.
but does this work for you?
Do you have preferences when conducting opera in terms of sitting or standing?
I always stand. Um, I sit in rehearsals because sometimes the tech rehearsals can really be long. But I prefer standing, uh, just because I think I get a lot more energy that way, and
Hmm.
I like to be active. I like to be in there with people.
Yep.
The one thing that I really don't enjoy, and because I'm not super super tall, this has happened a couple of times. I get really high risers because sometimes I can't see the stage,
Yeah.
or I can't see far onto the stage, and I will get risers, and then I feel like I'm hovering over everyone, and I
Hmm.
really don't enjoy that because I
Yeah.
again I like to be with people and I like to make music with them, and I sort of like that collegiality that happens.
Hmm.
But physics are physics, and if
Yeah.
I can see something, I can see something.
Something you conducted that many things you conducted I really enjoyed, but the one I'm going to talk about is Four Saints in Three Acts, which was co-presented
Uh,
with
the mother of
Juilliard.
us all.
I'm sorry, you're right.
The mother of us all.
I
Yeah.
conflate those two operas. To me, they're the same opera, but they're not. The Mother of Us All, thank you. With the Juilliard School at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the American Wing, um,
Hmm.
where I don't know, was it staged at Juilliard too, and then at the museum, or only at the museum?
No, we had rehearsals at Juilliard in one of the rehearsal spaces, um, with clear understanding of what the layout of the space was going to be. So one thing that I learned um, early on because of one of the earlier projects I did was if it's an unconventional space that singers have to deal with and essentially we have to deal with as well. is to try and put ourselves into a um, performance surrounding, performance space as
Hmm.
soon as possible, or in those parameters. So we had rehearsals at Juilliard, but I had asked that we put me and the piano in a position where the orchestra was going to be,
Hmm.
so that singers can already at that point start getting used to where they physically need to be to see a cue, if they need a cue, what needs to happen if they have difficulty seeing something, if there's a statue in front of them, that they can already start sort of pre-planning, when to turn, where to look, what to see. And we rely, in situations like that, we rely on monitors. Anything that doesn't have a clear contact with conductor, monitors are friends, which is, good and
For
bad.
people who don't know the word, monitors are screens.
Exactly,
We have an
exactly.
international audience, and not everyone knows monitors.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. So screens, yes.
Yeah.
So we already pre-planned where the screens are going to be. Again, in case the singers can't see a cue, in case they can't see me, they need to check in so that they would know where to look. So we rehearsed, I forget now how long the rehearsal process was, but we rehearsed everything at Juilliard, and then we moved into the space at the Met Museum. And that was then an adjustment again that, happens,
Well,
and
for people who
everybody,
don't know,
yeah.
the American wing of the Metropolitan Museum of Art is the northern part of the building. If you keep walking, you have the Temple of Dendur from Egypt.
Hmm.
You have the Armory Hall. You have the musical instruments collection. The Met Museum is magnificent, but it's very eclectic, and it's sort of odd to go from one room to the next and enter an entirely other era and
Yeah.
aesthetic. But this room is largely mid to late 19th century art and
Hmm.
objects and Tiffany glass.
Hmm.
It's a very high space. At one end is a view of Central Park, and there's sort of a cafe there. And where I sat was close to the cafe.
Hmm.
And but had I sat on the other side, it would have been much darker, and I would have
Hmm.
seen the light of the outside. I think I
Hmm.
was seated, I was given a seat to see you, not because I knew you then, I didn't, but because people want me to see the conductor, so to speak, which was fine.
Yeah.
So I had a good view of you. But I remember singers coming from my left,
Hmm.
stage right, um,
Okay.
and making entrances and exits. And I was trying to ask myself, how were audience members who were distributed among these works of art, and
Hmm.
therefore not in a traditional audience configuration, what were they perceiving? And I decided that my seat gave me one performance,
Hmm.
and a person elsewhere had an entirely other performance of the same opera. And not because the music was the same, but because the view was so different. And the sound, because this space is for art, it's not for music,
Hmm.
is not
Hmm.
the best
Hmm.
acoustic. Um, and how did you conduct and how did your team stage it, knowing that in effect it was very unconventional to do The Mother of Us All by Virgil Thompson in that space?
Um, I think we I think we knew that it was going to be a different experience for everyone. And I actually think about it a little bit watching traditional opera on stage. I think there is a little bit of self-directing element for every audience member because again, as we said earlier, you can decide what you want to focus on. Sometimes during arias I actually prefer to focus on everybody else on stage but the
Mhm.
principal who is singing an aria because I'm curious to see their reactions.
Yep.
And so I think in this way, we had the limitations were, are you sitting next to a statue? Is there a statue in front of you? And how much can you see? So that was the sort of frame that every audience member had to work around. But I think that can also be an incredibly exciting moment of sort of narrating your own direction of a production, of a
Mhm.
direction. So we knew that where the sort of blind spots were going to be, and we worked on never putting any important action in those moments, but sort of highlighting the important things where everybody can see them, even if it means that the view is not obstructed, but view may be, I don't know, 75% instead of 100%. But I think it's also these performances that can invite audiences back then to see new things, to experience things in a different way, because there's nothing more exciting than leaving a performance and talking to somebody else that you saw there and sort of sharing what that experience was for each person and saying, oh, I have to go back and see that again. Um, so I think there's incredible excitement in developing these performances also from audience members' perspective.
Now, not too long ago, you conducted, and unfortunately, I did not see the world premiere of another opera, 10 Days in a Madhouse, by Renee Ort. I would love to have seen it because I love your work, but also it had a terrific cast. It was at Opera
Hmm.
Philadelphia, and
Yeah.
I'm a huge admirer of Kira Duffy,
Hmm.
who a number of years ago starred in the opera version of Breaking the Waves.
Yes.
And
Hmm.
recently I had Zachary James on February 16th, Zachary James on as my guest, and
Hmm.
he was in that cast. And we spoke about that opera and that production. Missy Mazzoli, I believe, is the
Hmm.
composer.
Hmm.
And Kira Duffy was just astonishing. And, I mention this because she's not the first name on everyone's lips when you talk about current opera singers. And people say to me
Hmm.
all too often, oh, there are no good opera singers now. And I say, are you kidding? There are
Wow.
so many
Yeah.
wonderful opera singers right
They're
now.
fantastic. Yeah.
And maybe it's your limitation that you just want the next Marilyn Horner, Leontine Price, or whomever, who I adored both of them, worked
Yeah.
with both of them, adored them, magnificent. We're not going to have that again.
Yeah.
Leontine Price and Marilyn Horne and Luciano Pavarotti and Joan Sutherland, Leonie Rieseneck, Birgit Nielsen are once and done.
Yeah.
But we in our own time have fantastic opera singers.
Yes.
And Kira Duffy, who I don't know personally, I've never spoken to her, I just think she's sensational. So if you agree, what was it like developing a new opera with Kira Duffy?
Oh, it was amazing. But to your point, I just want to say this, and it's something that I've been thinking a lot about. We say, well, who is the new Mirella Freni, for instance, or Luciano Pavarotti? And it's so unfair to ask that question. It's, I mean, th those singers were authentic and they were who they were because they were true to themselves. And instead of comparing and sort of wanting to put things back from decades ago, we can say, well, who are the great singers nowadays? And I think there's so many wonderful singers who are
Yeah.
authentic and just beautiful performers. And I think if we keep on comparing artists to artists, we're not doing anybody a service. It's
Hmm.
it's just I think we collectively need to stop that and
Yeah.
sort of take the artist as they are and hear them and meet them where they are and hear what they have to say. But to your actual question,
Hmm.
working with Kira was just amazing. I had only seen her in Breaking the Waves a couple of years ago in New York, and thought she was just incredible. And we were this opera as well, 10 Days in a Madhouse. We had two workshops before we started production. So I got to meet Kira during the workshops, and the entire cast was just wonderful. And I also feel like I've been in every production I've done, I've been blessed with just amazing casts.
So
Um,
you had, I don't know how to
and
pronounce her first name, Rayanne Bryce Davis,
Rayanne Bryce Davis, yes,
mezzo soprano, fabulous.
Mrs.
Will
Fabulous,
Liverman,
fantastic.
baritone,
Will
fabulous.
Liverman,
Yep.
yes, and Lauren Pearl was the nurse, and
Yeah.
it was just
That's a great
such a
cast.
wonderful ensemble.
Yeah.
And the chorus we also had was nine women, prepared by Liz Braden. It was just like a former mentor of mine said that every opera ends up feeling like a family, and it's really, really true. When you find people that you enjoy working with, and no matter how long you're in a rehearsal room, it's sort of like spending time with family, and there's nothing better, in my opinion.
Unless you're doing
Um,
Electra. Or even Dutch Rheingold. I don't know if I want to be in that family.
fair point. Um,
Or the little
but
foxes in St. Louis. Most of the families, yes.
most of the families.
Yeah.
But it was really great working with everybody. We had the stage that we had, the set that we had, not the stage, but the set. I don't know if you saw any photos, but it was a little bit turned upside down. So the orchestra was on top of the set,
Hmm.
and all of the action was happening inside of the set, outside, and so on. So I never had a clear contact with singers. So again, we had to rely on screens.
Hmm.
We had to, fortunately, we could move into the space and start rehearsing in the performance
You,
situation.
you did this in Philadelphia, right?
Yes, yes.
Which theater?
This was the Wilma Theater. So it's
Yes,
a
okay, I
theater
know
that
the
doesn't
Wilma.
have a
Yeah.
pit. Yeah,
Hmm.
it's and a couple of years ago, this was my first introduction to Opera Philadelphia. We did double exposure
Hmm.
with music by Renee Ort and David Hertzberg. And it was at the same theater, with the exception that the orchestra was set sort of in the back wall, and my profile was to the audience, so I could still see singers and I could still we could have contact direct. But this time it was different, um, and I think we all went into that process thinking, well, if we start and end together, this is going to be amazing because the
Mm.
piece is musically tricky, it's challenging. And then, one thing about communication with stage is that it's incredible how much our eyes can communicate. And if somebody is just slightly off, if somebody's ahead or behind, or, whatever happens, you can catch that person with your eyes and get them back on track. Well, when you're 12 meters above the ground, you can't do that
Yeah.
because you're looking at a camera and who knows who you're looking at. So for that specific project, and this was the second one that I did of that kind. I learned American Sign Language, and I assigned alphabet to every character and every chorus entrance. And so I shared with the cast and with the entire ensemble what the cues are going to be for each one of them, and they knew if they saw. I'm forgetting them now, but if they saw a D, that was Doctor, that was Will Liverman. If they saw an N, that
Wow.
was Nellie, Kira Duffy, and so on. So it was,
Yeah.
yeah, it was a really fun project to put together, and again with incredible cast.
And so this was about Nellie Bly, who was sort of a
Hmm.
pioneering journalist.
Yes.
Talk about the evolution of the opera and what you had to learn about Nellie Bly.
Oh my God, it was fascinating. I didn't know about Nellie Bly until the workshop and until Renee was telling me about the piece. And it was just incredible to learn about this woman who was a pioneer of investigative journalism and who had this incredible strength to go into an unknown situation and really really be observant of the place and pretend that she was mad so that she would get in.
Hmm.
um it was just, I mean, talk about courage and talk about somebody forging and sort of having the perseverance to do what they wanted to do and believing in a cause. And throughout the production we learned about all of the different elements of what was Blackwell's Island, what the asylum was called. That basically the nurses were sometimes not even medical staff, but they were inmates from the prison on the same island. And it was just a gruesome moment in history. Really, really disturbing part of our human history. Um, but the production it actually went back in time, which was really interesting. It started with day 10 and then went back 10, 9, 8, 6, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, ending with Nellie's lecture that she was then doing about this reporting that she had done. So it was incredible to live in this world of history and of new discoveries being made and literally history being written, and sort of put oneself mind into what that could have been like, what that could have felt like, which I find always fascinating when we do opera. I mean, there's so much history in opera, and there are so many incredible stories that are based in history.
Hmm.
I just read a book called When Women Ruled the World,
Yeah.
and it's about Caterina de' Medici, uh, Queen Elizabeth, Mary Stuart, Mary Tudor, and you start immediately thinking about all of the Queen's operas and
Hmm.
how fascinating that is, and sort of like
Yeah.
historical facts that happen in that.
Yeah.
So that was a production of 10 days.
You are, well, before I ask you this, I'm going to say something else. I get European friends upset all the time because I say to them, America, by which I mean North America, um, is the world center of new opera.
Mm,
And we have so many new operas being written, and we have people who fund and develop it. We have companies that
mhm,
devote themselves, from little companies to the very big ones like the Met. But Opera America helps give funding to the promotion of new works. People like Francesca Zambello in Washington and Cooperstown encourage that. People
mhm,
everywhere encourage that. San Francisco has done a lot of new operas. The Met of recent years has, but it's everywhere. Philadelphia,
mhm,
absolutely. Cincinnati,
mhm,
Fellow Travelers, which is something you've
mhm,
conducted, a wonderful opera.
mhm,
Um, and when I, as an opera flag waver, advocate, teacher, talk about this with audience members, younger people are often enthusiastic. Some older people are too. But I would say that the biggest problem with new opera is getting a second production.
yes, yeah,
Because let's say an opera is a big hit, or let's say an
mhm,
opera was not perfect in its first production. I recently spoke with an opera composer, very established, excellent composer, and he told me that one of his works in its first time out didn't really work. There
mhm,
were casting issues, there were other issues, and he was able to revisit that opera and get a second production, and they worked out the problems. I
yeah,
remind people that the Barber of Seville and La Traviata were failures when they came out,
yeah,
and Verdi went back and reworked them. Madame Butterfly
exactly,
was a
yeah,
failure. So the it's not one and done.
yeah,
And if I've seen opera X, a new not X, because that's the name of an opera.
right.
If I see a given opera the first time and I don't love it, well, maybe it's me. Maybe it's not the production. Maybe I didn't like what I ate for dinner, or maybe I just am not focused, or maybe the musical language is hard for me and I need to study it more. Uh, but I do think that I can't think of another country that has generated so much new opera. Obviously, Austria, Germany, Finland,
Mhm.
France, UK are countries that do that. But I don't see a movement of the scale and of the diversity that we're seeing in the United States and Canada.
I think there's a little bit of a different philosophy between, again, Europe and United States, and how we approach contemporary opera and how we go on about creating new opera. Um, from what my experience has been in Europe, I think it can be a little bit more transactional. Sort of, here's a commission, you write it, we put it on, and if it survives, it survives, and if it doesn't go anywhere, that's okay. In the United States, there's a much bigger investment from the companies in giving composers a workshop and librettists a workshop to go through the piece and really craft it together with people who are going to be performing. But it's absolutely rare to see a second production of an opera. And what I also always think is, Falstaff at some point was a contemporary opera. At
Yeah.
that time, it was a contemporary opera, and uh, Verdi, they spent 2 months on rehearsing it. And part of those 2 months was actually rewriting and what we would call workshopping nowadays.
Hmm.
It was really about, you know, fitting the fitting the pieces of the puzzle together in the best possible way. Um, I was reading just now about Handel, and the sort of speed with which he could write operas, because he had to write them for the Haymarket Theatre in
Yeah, the
London.
Royal Haymarket in London.
Exactly, and with Cesare specifically, he took so much time to write that piece because he wanted to change a couple of structural things, and he wanted to pay more attention to the dramatic narrative and the entire dramatic arc of the piece. So I think
And he
if
had to
we
eat.
don't, and that as well.
You know about Handel that he would go to a restaurant in London where he lived for many years and order dinner for three, and the waiter would say, "Are you waiting for your guests?" He said, "No," and he would eat all three.
That sounds like the scene from the movie The Phantom Thread with Daniel Day-Lewis
Yes, yeah.
when he goes into that little restaurant and orders everything off the menu, and it's a oh, hungry boy. Um, but I think, I think we need to give every piece a second chance. To our example, and there are so many other examples of composers going back to pieces and rewriting them and maybe tweaking orchestration or making cuts or making whatever. I mean, composers also change, and their work can change. So I think it would be only fair to give new works a second life, to give a second production, to find a second reading. There are so few of the operas that I have traced so far that have, after the premiere, that have had a second production. I'm not sure why that is, but it would be nice to see some of the repertoire or some of the newer works, get a second life and get a second option, get a second chance.
I think maybe a fund from a nice wealthy person. There are plenty of them around, but they put their money in yachts and not in opera productions. Um, could be created that would be called the either revival fund or the second production fund. Not revival because then it's the same production. Um, in which money is specifically allocated to do a second production of a new
Mm,
opera.
yeah,
And, very wealthy people can fund the new production and then put other money in the second production fund. But that's how these works take hold.
yeah.
Um, I've seen, well, a very famous example is Dead Man Walking by Jake
Hmm.
Hagee. I
Hmm.
happened to see the original in San Francisco when it
Hmm.
premiered. I've seen numerous productions of it. Um, I saw his Moby Dick in Dallas, which I adored, and I think they probably made a few adjustments to it. It is getting a new production at the Met next season,
Hmm. Yes.
but
Hmm.
it's never been to the Met. But Jake Hagee is a very established person,
Hmm.
and Tobias Picker, and there are a number of
Hmm.
people who are becoming very established now, but they're the exceptions.
Hmm.
And but there are many people who are like Janine Tesori is a very famous Broadway composer.
Hmm.
She's less known for opera, I think, but nonetheless, she's a wonderful composer,
Yeah.
I think. And therefore, we need to make sure that these operas that are new are then produced again.
Right. And I think now, as I hear you speak, I think our expectations of new operas falls a little bit in line of our expectations of singers. That we, whether we want it or not, we end up comparing things. And I mean, what's the point in comparing something? It's sort of see it for what it is. It can either speak to you, or it doesn't speak to you. And if it doesn't, that's okay. And if it does, that's okay too. Um, but I think sort of coming into a new piece, into a new product, into a new opera, with an expectation of I'm going to see the new Traviata, that's not going to happen because the times are different and
Mhm.
how we speak is different, how we communicate is different. Everything that makes life influences art, and therefore it can't be a reproduction of something else.
Mhm. Wow, I like that.
Oh, thank you.
I'm going to put that on my business card and say it was from you.
Oh,
Um,
thank you.
so I would like to speak to you about two organizations you are very closely associated with.
Mhm.
You are principal conductor of Opera Theater of St. Louis. Now, I have been to most of the opera world. I've never been to St. Louis. I know
You
it's a
have to come.
wonderful, I want to. I know it's a wonderful company. I know from everyone who works there that they love it. I've known people who've worked there through the years. I love its ideas. I love that it's like the English National Opera of the United States doing opera in English. I know that it has generated new works and revivals.
Mhm.
I was talking about Mark Blitzstein's Regina, Little
Regina. Hmm.
Foxes,
Hmm.
which I was very sorry to miss. The casting looked wonderful.
Hmm.
Um, it's a seasonal opera company. It's not all the year. And
No.
therefore, I know people who go to St. Louis and settle in for a week. And if you were me, go to a baseball game, the St. Louis Cardinals, and eat good Italian and barbecue and other food in St. Louis. North Hill, I think it's called. Is that what it's called? The
Yes.
North Hill,
Hmm.
yeah.
North Hill. Hmm.
And, you know, visit the great singer Christine Brewer, who lives there. There's wonderful things to do in St. Louis, and I'd love to go. But a big part of it is that I know that the opera company is fantastic. How did you become involved with them? You are now their principal conductor.
Hmm.
Talk about the
Uh,
company.
yeah, my first invitation came in 21 for the festival season 21, which was right on the heels of pandemic. And during that, not to sort of like dwell too much in the 2020 and the pandemic year, but I was going to have my first Rusalka in 2020 at Cincinnati Opera, and I was going to do a little bit more traditional repertoire, which complements the contemporary music repertoire that I do. So when pandemic happened, I sort of thought, oh my God, what now? What happens? And magically somehow, I got invited to do the three short contemporary operas, the three world premieres essentially, that were taking place that year in St. Louis. It was part of the program New Works, Bold Voices. And we had James Robinson directed. We had a really fun time working together. And this was, I had assisted on a production at Manhattan School of Music when James came to direct. So I knew him as a sort of assistant slash chorus master, and I had hoped to work with him at some point as a colleague. And then 2021 happened, and there we were suddenly like in the room making art together,
Mhm.
which was really great, and a dream come true. And after that production, I got asked the question if I would like to be involved with the company on a more permanent basis, which was then not resident, principal conductor, sorry, principal conductor, and that was in 2021. So my first season in this new position was 2022, and that season I did Carmen. Last season we did Tosca. This season I have Giulio Cesare coming up, and we also have an extension. So it's been really wonderful. I knew that on my way to St. Louis, I was coming from Phoenix, Arizona, because we had just finished the project there. And I was I was at the airport seeing the St. Louis sign, and I thought, oh my God, it's finally happening. It's a company that I wanted to be involved with when I was a student at Indiana. But again,
Mhm.
as an international student, you can't really work in the United States. So there were all these logistical problems that were preventing me working in the United States as a student. Um, and I knew that I was going to like the company. I did not know how much I was going to fall in love with the company and with the city of St. Louis. It's really, like I said earlier, I have two homes, one in Serbia, one in Slovenia. I have a home in New York, and St. Louis is also my home because all of these places are just so unique and spectacular. And St. Louis, I can't wait to go back. I have a short trip this week and then next week again, and then our festival season. But the company is really wonderful. I adore my colleagues. I love that we get to collaborate on the repertoire. We get to sort of exchange ideas. We get to talk about casting together. We get to, uh, dream of operas we want to do and what would the audience want and what is interesting.
I
And you
gather
should
too there's
absolutely
a,
come and visit.
I will. I gather
Yeah,
too there's a wonderful art museum in St. Louis. A friend of mine
there
who's
is.
in the music field used to work
Yes.
there, and he
Yes.
told me all about it.
Yeah. I
And
haven't been to the zoo yet, but zoo is apparently supposed to be really, really great as well.
yeah,
And I've been to the Cardinals game. We also have a
yeah,
new soccer stadium, which was exciting.
yeah.
So I've been to a Cardinals game and I've been to the soccer stadium. I've been to the St. Louis City Club game.
Well, people who are not baseball people or Americans may not know that there are eight old teams. Baseball now has, I don't know how many, maybe 32 teams, something like that, but there are eight classic old teams. And the two best were my New York Yankees and the St. Louis Cardinals.
Oh,
And
wow.
I go to baseball games in different cities because I really love it. And many opera
Hmm.
lovers love baseball and vice versa. There's a strong
Yeah,
connection there for all kinds of reasons. One being the sort of the pitcher and the catcher is like conductor and singer and so on. It's a very similar. And the fact that the
interesting.
time lengths are different and the protagonism it's very particular. The fact that it's not about acquisition of territory and points. It's about spatial design and about looking out. It's really wonderful.
Yeah,
And if you get into it, you really do. And so I tend to go to baseball games in different cities when I
yeah.
go to opera in those cities. San Francisco is terrific for
Huh.
that, among the best. New York, certainly. Los Angeles, certainly. Um, Phoenix, Arizona, where I know you've conducted.
Yeah,
Um, the baseball is in Dallas. There are a lot of places where there's
yeah.
really this strong connection, and the Chicago Cubs and White Sox in Chicago. And so the one I'm missing is St. Louis. So, and they
Well, there
really,
we go.
the Yankees have won the most championships, and the St. Louis Cardinals are second. So that it's
Okay.
really a crucial thing, and I have to
Yeah.
come. But
Well, and
the
I
other,
also think to the point of
yeah,
sports, I actually think there's a lot of parallels between soccer and opera because there is a dramaturgy in soccer game between
yeah,
the two halves. And so I think I didn't grow up necessarily watching soccer unless Yugoslavia or Serbia was playing sort of in European Cups or World Cups. Um, but I think I just love the game and
usually
I
it was
love seeing St.
Croatia, my
Louis.
dear.
Well, we don't talk about that. I'm kidding. We excel in Serbia. We excel in
Basketball,
basketball.
I know.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but the other institution, one that I do know and have a very strong connection and feeling for, is the wonderful Music Academy of the West in Santa
Hmm.
Barbara, California, um, where my dad was a musician. He went there in 1962, and
Oh,
like he was a New York Giants fan. Was a baseball team. They moved to San Francisco, and he spent a summer at the Music Academy of the West, but then went up to San Francisco, not Los Angeles for the Dodgers, but San
yeah.
Francisco for the Giants. And it
Hmm.
was one of the best summers of his life,
Oh,
um,
fantastic.
because
Yeah,
he studied with Lotte Lehman, even though he was a trombonist. Um, Grace Bumbry was there. Marilyn Horn was there. Marilyn Horn later
yeah,
became the head of the
yeah.
music program. She's an old friend of mine. And it's a wonderful place. Talk about the Music
Absolutely.
Academy of the West.
Absolutely. My eyes got a little bit bigger when you said your dad was a trombonist because my husband is a trombonist, bass
Ah,
trombonist, and he also studied at Music Academy when he was a student at Juilliard. But yeah, I've been the first production I did at Music Academy was Cold Mountain. Speak of second productions of
mhm.
an opera. It was Cold Mountain by Jennifer Higdon, and it was again just such a wonderful experience working with students and working with music staff. John Churchwell from San Francisco Opera is head of the opera. And it was just a really, really wonderful experience. That was another program that again, as a student, I was hoping to get into, but again, it was, at that time I was dealing with all these visa hurdles and Fulbright would put you on a specific visa, and so you could only do these things and so on.
Yeah.
Um, so I feel like when I go to Music Academy, I'm obviously there in an official capacity of preparing opera, and for most of the students in the orchestra, that might be their first opera experience.
Hmm.
So the biggest compliment I've gotten was from students who would return the next summer and request to play an opera and say we fell in love with it completely.
Hmm.
And I've worked now with students who are, some of them are now in professional orchestras, and they would always say that was my first opera experience and it was so much fun and I enjoyed it so much and I want to play opera again and I can't
Hmm.
wait to do it again. That I think is the sort of the biggest reward that one can have when working with a student body, sort of opening their ears and minds to this art form and making them fall in love with it.
Yeah.
And at Music Academy last summer, we did La Boheme. This summer, we're doing Carmen, which is one of my favorite operas. In the big anniversary year, we did Onegin, that was in 22.
Hmm.
We did Onegin. So they really get exposed, both the vocal fellows and the instrumental fellows um, get exposed to this core repertoire of opera, and they get to experience it for the first time. And just we have a great time every year.
So, in your capacity as someone who teaches there and works there, if you hear a particular instrumentalist or singer,
Hmm.
do you then file that person's name and ability in your head and think, if I'm in Philadelphia, Washington, or wherever I am, and this might be an important role or important chair in an orchestra, do you sort of summon that person or recommend that person? How does that work?
If I get asked, I don't like to impose my wishes onto a company that I'm working with, because everybody again knows, every company knows their audience the best, and they know who is in their town the best.
Yeah.
So if I get asked, would you recommend somebody? Then absolutely.
Hmm.
But I won't just sort of like throw out names and say you should hire this person.
Yeah.
That's not how I operate.
I could talk to you about a lot of things, but I only have time for two more.
Okay.
Um, One is that you made your New York Philharmonic debut
Hmm.
with Yo-Yo Ma,
Yes.
playing one of my very favorite pieces of all, the Elgar Cello Concerto.
Mm.
Say whatever you want about that experience.
I was so nervous, first of all. I mean, this was the fourth project. This was my first debut with the entire orchestra with the New York Philharmonic. Prior to that, we did three different projects. The first one was The Mother of Us All with musicians from the Philharmonic. And then there was a streaming project with the brass section in 21, in March of 21. And then we did the Moby Dick movie at the Shed with the string section of the New York Philharmonic.
So not the
So
Jake
this was
Hagee Moby Dick, another
not the
Moby
Jake
Dick.
Aggie,
Right.
no.
Yeah.
This was Caroline Shaw and Andrew Yee composed a score to a movie by Wu Tsang, and that was shown at the Shed, and we were playing live music to that. Um, and then this was the first time working with the full orchestra in traditional repertoire. So I was terrified, to be honest. I like, how can you not be? Um, but Mr. Ma, Yo-Yo Ma, was so wonderful. He came into my dressing room before we went on stage, and he just wanted to meet me and talk to me a little bit about Elgar. And we also had a really tight schedule. We had one rehearsal on a Monday, and then dress rehearsal on Tuesday, and the concert Tuesday night. So, I mean, talk about being prepared and just sort of going. There's no room for error in other ways. Um, but the Philharmonic was so wonderful, and through working now in New York City, a lot of the players are good colleagues and friends, and it was just fantastic being in that space. And it was a renovated hall, so the acoustics had completely changed. I had heard them obviously in the old hall, and this was just sort of out of world experience. It was amazing. Once the sort of initial terror
Mhm.
of dissipated, if that's a word in English. After 10 minutes of playing with them, then I thought, oh, this is easy. This is amazing.
So in the new David Geffen Hall, and by the way, the acoustician Paul Scarborough was a guest on the show a
Hmm.
while back.
Hmm.
Um, the conductor faces not just the players, but she looks beyond. There's sort of a
Right.
section of seven or
Yes.
eight rows. And the first I saw that way was Susanna Melke conducting. And I watched her.
Yeah.
For me as an audience member, it's fascinating to watch a conductor because I sat behind the brass section and could see the trumpet score. And
Mm.
I don't play trumpet, but I was following the trumpet score and watching her conduct and give cues to the trumpet player. It was a very particular experience. It was
Yeah.
Stravinsky.
Yeah.
But what's it like? Again, you said what it's like to feel the audience behind you. What about
Hmm.
when they're in front of you and it's rather well lit up there?
I mean, honestly, I look at the musicians. I can't look at anything that's not us at that moment, just because the focus needs to be 100% there
Yeah.
for the duration, and anything that can distract is not going to be helpful. There was a similar experience in the hall of Berlin Philharmonic,
Yeah.
where audience also sits around, and I mean, I just look at musicians, I look at us, what we're doing and whatnot, and I sort of can't look into the audience and try to read their expressions, because then that would start a chatter in my mind that would probably not be useful for the performance. But I did sit in LA Phil. I went to see Dudamel conduct
Hmm.
um, an all American program when I was there about a year and a half ago. And it was fascinating being in that room and sort of seeing the musicians from the other end and seeing the conductor face on.
In April of 2018, I was in Berlin and went to a concert performance of Tristan und Isolde at the
Hmm.
Philharmonie with
Yeah.
Simon Rattle
Hmm.
conducting. And Nina Stemmer was Isolde. And my seat was, and I exaggerate not, at her feet. So that in effect, I was staring at her. She was wearing a long gown, but where her ankles and knees would have been, and her sound was going above my head.
Wow.
But I would have to lean back to see her face, and I didn't want to do that. So I just stared at Nina Stemmer's legs for 5 hours. But heard the Liebestod, though I've never heard it before or
Yeah.
since, because I have never sat that close to an
Yeah.
Isolde in my life. One doesn't get to do
Yeah.
that very often.
Yeah.
And if you do, it's only when you're on stage and for only the parts you're on stage with her. If I were
Right.
Brangena or King Mark or Tristan. But um, in this case, I just had the sound. And it was so magnificent because, yes, it was only Isolde, and Tristan and the other characters were not near me that way.
Hmm.
So, but it was a remarkable experience.
Yeah.
And we
Well,
go, if we're lucky, more times than once, so that we
yeah.
have these different
Yeah.
experiences. And I remember that day and always will, not just for Nina Stemma's gown, which was sort of a magenta color, by the way, but for the sound,
Hmm.
for being so
Yeah.
close to that sound that
Yeah.
Wagner composed and Nina Stemma sings so well for hours. It
Hmm.
that was mind bending in the best way.
Yeah. Well, I always think that if if we really want to, not if we really want to, we want to obviously, but if we want to open another experience for audience in terms of classical music, one way to do that would be to sit them behind an orchestra during a rehearsal.
Mm,
Because as you had the experience that you get from immediately feeling the vibration and feeling the sound, it is you can't recreate that
yeah.
on sort of on a daily basis by
Hmm.
yourself. So really experiencing that, tremolo that basses do or a
Yeah.
roll that timpani does, and just feeling that from the ground up, I think it's, yeah, life changing.
Yeah. My final question, though I know I could have 100 more. Um, you're also a composer,
Yes.
and you've had commissions from many major orchestras. You could list
Mm.
them if you want, but Boston and Cleveland and Detroit. I'm looking at my list: Pittsburgh and the Met Opera Orchestra, New York Philharmonic, New York City Ballet, and more. I'm sure.
Players from those orchestras, to be
Players,
specific. Players
players.
from these
Okay, got
orchestras,
it,
yeah.
got it. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Hmm.
Um, when you conduct, do you conduct also with a composer in her head? You thought I was going to ask you about composing, but but because I know composer conductors, and many of them feel that they connect to Mahler or whomever,
Hmm.
Beethoven, but it's often Mahler they talk about, um, in particular ways, whereas others say that they separate their own compositional mind and abilities from getting into the mind of the work of the composer they're conducting at the moment.
Hmm. Well, I always thought that I separate myself, that I separate my compositional brain, from my composer brain, my conducting brain. But then I worked with a composer who told me, no, you actually don't. So they thought that I bring into if I'm conducting their piece, that I bring some of my understanding of composition, and actually help them. I can't speak to their experience, but I really do try to sort of separate my compositional brain from the performing brain and the conducting brain, um, and see it as a piece that I'm putting into life rather than a piece that as a composer I'm going to have something to adjust or maybe suggest to how to change things. As I said earlier, I love talking to composers about why they write certain things the way that they do, and that question of why motivates a lot of my study, a lot of my productions, a lot of my work.
Mhm.
But I love to get into brains of composers and sort of ask, well, why did you write it this way? And, why is it orchestrated this way? What was the color that you were looking for? So I really try to sort of separate those two entities and serve the composer rather than imposing my thoughts onto their piece.
If I could give you a Fulbright to go live in the brain of one composer for 6 months, which composer do you pick?
Oh my God. Ooh, I think it would have to be Mahler or Strauss. Oh, Strauss. Richard.
Which, by the way, listeners know that I asked my guests to give recommendations from the Adagio catalog, and Daniela recommended Strauss among others. Why Strauss?
By Strauss. So, um, I love his harmonic language. I think there are so many colors in the textures, in the harmonies. There are incredible moments that he knew exactly how to place them in a perfect place, that they just completely pull at your heartstrings
Hmm.
and just make the most glorious music that is, sorry, my earpod fell out. um, that just makes sort of all sense of life.
Yep.
I don't
And
know if
while
that
you're
makes
there,
sense,
you can
but yeah,
find out his secret to card playing because he was a master card player.
he was.
If you
Yes.
go to Garmisch, you see his home, and the whole
Yes.
section is his game room where he would play cards with his friends. And that's
Yeah,
how
well,
he spent a
maybe
lot.
that's what I need to
The
pick
great
up.
Richard Strauss was a card player.
Yeah, who did I? Oh, I read recently about Mahler and Puccini meeting, and they didn't talk about each other's compositions or compositional processes, but instead what they do was play cards. So,
Really?
yeah, something to be said about that.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Daniela Candillari, let's spell your last name.
Canddillari.
CAN.com is your website.
Hmm.
And so people can find out where you are, what you're doing, because you are one of the busiest artists in our world. And I will get to St. Louis. In the meantime, you and I will go eat with your husband at the restaurant where the waiter is from Novi Sad here in New York.
Perfect.
Okay?
Perfect.
I
Yes.
thank you very much, and I will see you
Thank
soon.
you. Thank you, Fred.